The year is 1983. Deep in the forests of West Germany, a man named Viktor Petrov stands in the pre-dawn darkness, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. He's not a soldier, at least not officially. His passport says he's a trade representative from East Germany. His real employer is the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. What you just saw is only the beginning. The Cold War's darkest secrets run much deeper than you think. If you want the full story, the operations they tried to bury, the spies who changed history, and the documents that were classified for 50 years, subscribe to Cold War Black Files right now. New episodes drop every your schedule, and trust me, you won't want to miss what we're uncovering next. For months, Viktor has been watching, taking photographs, counting trucks, mapping roads. His handlers in Moscow are obsessed with one question: where are the Americans hiding their army? On paper, the math doesn't add up. The United States has pledged to defend Western Europe, but they only keep 2 divisions permanently stationed in Germany. 2 divisions. Against the Soviet Union's ready force of over 50 divisions, backed by thousands upon thousands of tanks stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It seems laughable. Soviet war planners have calculated everything. They know exactly how long it takes to ship an American tank division across the Atlantic by sea, 30 days minimum. By that time, Soviet forces would be drinking coffee in Paris. The Americans would arrive to find a conquered continent. This is why Viktor's orders are so urgent. Moscow suspects something. The Americans are too confident, too relaxed. There must be something the Soviets are missing. And there is. Let's go back to understand how we got here. After the Second World War ended, Europe was a wasteland. Cities lay in ruins. Economies had collapsed. And into this vacuum came 2 superpowers with fundamentally incompatible visions for the future. The Soviet Union maintained massive standing armies in Eastern Europe. Over 40 divisions in East Germany alone, with thousands more troops stationed across Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. These weren't just occupation forces. They were an invasion force in waiting, positioned less than 100 miles from the Rhine River. The United States faced an impossible problem. Americans had fought in Europe twice in 30 years and had no desire to station millions of soldiers overseas permanently. The American public demanded demobilization. Soldiers wanted to go home. Congress wanted to cut military spending. But the threat was real and growing. NATO intelligence estimated the Warsaw Pact could mobilize for war within 48 hours. The Soviet plan was brutally simple. A massive armoured thrust through the Fulda Gap and the North German Plain, splitting NATO forces and reaching the Atlantic before American reinforcements could arrive. The conventional wisdom said this scenario was unstoppable. You simply couldn't move an army across the Atlantic Ocean quickly enough to matter. The logistics were impossible. And that's where someone asked a revolutionary question. What if you didn't have to? What if the equipment was already there, waiting? What if you only had to fly the soldiers? The concept was called REFORGER. Return of forces to Germany. And it would become the most elaborate game of military chess ever played. Here's how it worked. Throughout the 1970s, in absolute secrecy, the United States began constructing massive warehouse complexes across West Germany. They called them POMKA sites, pre-positioning of materiel configured in unit sets. Each site contained enough equipment for an entire brigade: tanks, armoured vehicles, artillery pieces, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies, even uniforms and boots. Everything an army needs except the soldiers themselves. These weren't just storage facilities. They were climate-controlled fortresses designed to keep hundreds of millions of dollars worth of military equipment in perfect fighting condition for years. Inside these warehouses sat row after row of M1 Abrams tanks, their turbine engines preserved and ready, Bradley fighting vehicles, their weapons systems sealed against corrosion, M109 howitzers with ammunition already palletized for rapid deployment. The sites were hidden in plain sight, disguised as civilian warehouses or rail depots. Most were located near major airports and autobahns, positioned for maximum speed of deployment. But the equipment was only half the equation. The other half was even more audacious: the airlift. The United States began building the largest military transport fleet in history. C-5 Galaxies and C-141 Starlifters, aircraft capable of carrying hundreds of soldiers each across the Atlantic in a matter of hours. The plan called for a continuous air bridge, planes landing every few minutes at German airports, disgorging troops who would immediately move to the POMCUS sites, draw their equipment, and head to defensive positions. From mobilization order to tanks crossing the inter-German border, 72 hours. It was insane. It was brilliant. And nobody knew if it would actually work. Let's return to Viktor, our GRU agent. It's now October 1983, and something is happening. Activity at American bases has spiked. Transport aircraft are arriving at Frankfurt and Rhine-Main air bases in unprecedented numbers. Viktor photographs everything, sends encrypted reports to his handlers. But he doesn't understand what he's seeing. Not yet. This is REFORGER 83, one of the annual exercises designed to test and refine the system. Over the next week, nearly 20,000 American soldiers will fly from bases in the United States directly to Germany. Viktor watches them arrive, these troops in combat gear pouring off transport planes. Then something happens that Viktor cannot explain. Within hours, these soldiers who arrived with nothing but rifles and rucksacks are suddenly driving M1 Abrams tanks. Brand new, perfectly maintained, fully armed tanks appearing as if by magic. Viktor follows a column of these tanks as it moves toward exercise areas near the East German border. He counts them. Over 200 main battle tanks, plus Bradley fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery, multiple rocket launchers, all moving with purpose, all crewed by soldiers who were in Kansas 48 hours ago. His report to Moscow is marked urgent. He uses the phrase that will become infamous in Soviet military intelligence circles: instant army. In Moscow, the implications land like a bomb. Soviet war planners have been building their strategy on a foundation of sand. Every calculation, every timeline, every operational plan has assumed they would have weeks to conquer Western Europe before American reinforcements arrived in strength. But if the Americans can deploy 5 divisions, fully equipped and combat ready, within 3 days, the entire Soviet war plan collapses. The window of opportunity slams shut before it even opens. Let's understand the numbers. A Soviet breakthrough required massive force concentration. Thousands of tanks pushing through relatively narrow corridors. They needed to achieve local superiority of at least 3-1, preferably 5-1. This was achievable if they only faced the 2 American divisions already in Germany, plus whatever German and British forces could mobilize quickly. But add 5 more American divisions, appearing almost instantly. The math changes completely. Now Soviet forces would be fighting near peer numbers from day one. The Blitzkrieg becomes a grinding battle of attrition, exactly what Soviet planners wanted to avoid. There's another dimension to this that's even more devastating to Soviet plans. The POMCUS sites meant American equipment was being constantly updated and maintained without the massive expense of shipping new vehicles across the ocean. When the M1 Abrams tank entered service, replacing the older M60, the POMCUS sites were restocked with Abrams. When new ammunition types were developed, they were shipped to Germany and stored. The pre-positioned forces were always equipped with cutting-edge technology. Soviet intelligence officers trying to track American military capability now faced a nightmare scenario. The equipment in Germany was often newer and better maintained than what American units trained with back home. They couldn't gauge American combat effectiveness by watching training exercises in Texas or California. The real army, the one that would actually fight, was sitting in German warehouses. The Soviets attempted to map every POMCUS site. Spy satellites photographed the warehouses. Agents like Viktor tried to penetrate security. They learned some locations, but never all of them. The Americans had built redundancy into the system. Even if some sites were destroyed in a surprise attack, others would survive. And there was something else that deeply unnerved Soviet military planners. The Americans practiced REFORGER every year. sometimes multiple times per year. Each exercise got faster, more efficient, procedures were refined, bottlenecks were eliminated, problems were identified and solved. This meant American combat readiness wasn't static, it was continuously improving. Every REFORGER exercise was both a training event and a threat demonstration. The Soviets could watch American soldiers flying into Germany, drawing equipment, and forming combat units with increasing speed and precision. By the mid-1980s, some REFORGER exercises were achieving deployment times under 48 hours from mobilization to combat-ready forces crossing the inter-German border. 48 hours. Less than 2 days to conjure an army from thin air. Think about what this meant psychologically. Every Soviet officer planning the invasion of Western Europe had to consider that the moment they crossed the border, they triggered this response. American soldiers would begin boarding planes in dozens of bases across the United States. The air bridge would activate. Within 2 days, the small American presence in Germany would triple or quadruple in strength. And here's the truly elegant part of the strategy. It was entirely defensive, but absolutely effective. The United States couldn't use REFORGER to invade anyone. The system only worked if you had permission to land transport aircraft at Allied airfields and access to pre-positioned equipment. But for the defense of Western Europe, it was nearly perfect. The economic dimension is staggering. Maintaining a large standing army in Europe would have cost the United States tens of billions of dollars annually. Soldiers need housing, schools for their families, hospitals, commissaries, recreational facilities. The infrastructure required to support 10 divisions permanently stationed overseas would have been enormous. REFORGER achieved the same military effect at a fraction of the cost. Equipment doesn't need housing. Tanks don't have families requiring schools and medical care. The POMCUS sites required security and maintenance, but nothing compared to the cost of keeping 100,000 additional soldiers and their dependents in Germany year-round. This was Cold War strategy at its most sophisticated, achieving military superiority, not through brute force, but through innovation, logistics, and industrial capacity. The United States turned its greatest advantage, its ability to move people and material across vast distances, into a weapon system. Soviet responses were telling. Throughout the 1980s, Warsaw Pact exercises increasingly focused on scenarios involving rapid advances deep into NATO territory in the first hours of war. They knew they had to either prevent REFORGER from deploying or make its deployment irrelevant by conquering so much territory so quickly that American reinforcements would arrive too late to matter. But this required even more forces concentrated even more obviously on the border, which increased NATO's warning time and made the Soviet threat more transparent. It was a strategic trap. Every move the Soviets made to counter REFORGER either cost more resources or made their intentions more obvious, or both. By the late 1980s, something remarkable was happening. Soviet military doctrine was adapting in ways that suggested they had concluded a conventional war in Europe was unwinnable. Discussions about inevitable tactical nuclear weapon use increased. This was essentially an admission that they couldn't achieve victory through conventional means alone. Viktor Petrov, our GRU agent, was reassigned in 1987. His new posting was monitoring chemical weapons facilities. The message was clear. If war came to Europe, it wouldn't be the tank battle Soviet planners had been preparing for. It would be something far more desperate and apocalyptic. But war didn't come. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. 2 years later, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The Cold War ended not with nuclear holocaust, but with the collapse of one side's will to continue the competition. Military historians still debate exactly how much REFORGER contributed to this outcome. It's impossible to isolate any single factor in something as complex as the Cold War's conclusion. But we can say this with certainty. REFORGER made conventional Soviet victory in Europe implausible without making NATO appear threatening or aggressive. It was deterrence in its purest form, an army that could appear almost instantly but cost relatively little to maintain. A sword that never needed to be drawn because everyone knew it was there and knew it worked. The POMCUS sites were gradually drawn down after the Cold War. Equipment was returned to the United States or redistributed. The warehouses were closed or converted to other uses. The system that had been maintained in razor-sharp readiness for decades stood down. But the concept didn't die. When the United States deployed forces to Afghanistan and Iraq in the 21st century, it used variations of the same principle: pre-positioning equipment in theater, flying in soldiers, achieving rapid deployment without the cost and vulnerability of massive sea transport. The lesson of REFORGER extends beyond military strategy. It's a lesson about how problems that appear impossible can be solved through lateral thinking. The conventional wisdom said you couldn't move an army across the Atlantic quickly enough to defend Europe. REFORGER didn't argue with that wisdom. It simply made moving the army unnecessary. It's a lesson about the power of logistics and organization over raw military force. The Soviets had more tanks, more soldiers, more artillery. But REFORGER made those numerical advantages irrelevant by changing the fundamental geometry of the battlefield. And perhaps most importantly, it's a lesson about deterrence. The best victory is the war that never happens. REFORGER achieved something remarkable. It helped maintain peace for decades by making war pointless. Soviet planners couldn't conceive a scenario where invasion of Western Europe ended in victory, so they never tried. That's the untold story of REFORGER. Not a battle fought or a war won in the conventional sense, but a strategic masterpiece that helped check Soviet expansion and ultimately contributed to ending the Cold War itself. An invisible army that defended Europe simply by existing, ready to materialize from warehouses and airports the moment it was needed. The troops who participated in REFORGER exercises, the logistics specialists who maintained the POMCUS sites, the planners who conceived and refined the system, most of them served without public recognition. There were no victory parades for REFORGER, because its greatest achievement was preventing the war where victory parades would have been necessary. But in the forests of Germany, in those hidden warehouses with their rows of silent tanks, an army waited. And because it waited, ready and capable, it never had to fight. Sometimes the greatest victory is the battle never joined, the war never fought, the peace maintained not through weakness but through strength so obvious and overwhelming that testing it becomes unthinkable. That was REFORGER, the invisible army that won the Cold War.